This show is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network.
To join our community Discord or see more content from our members, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com.
On today's episode, we discuss relaxed environments, gameplay presentations, and how character knowledge breeds the greatest agency and expression. This is the DM Shower Thoughts. Welcome back. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to today's episode of the DM Shower Thoughts, the show where we talk about our shower thoughts in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons and other tabletop scenarios, how to become your best self through gaming. My name is Adamus.
I'm John.
And I'm Ian.
And gentlemen, I'm going to kick things off with a shower thought that it really has multiple facets. It's kind of a broad thing, so I'll just say it and then give you some examples. And this is the comfort in kind of pulling back the curtain or pulling back the Dungeon Master screen. Now, in literal context, all of us here, I think, have rolled in the open a lot of the time when we work with our players. When it comes to Grey Owls, certain groups, well, I will kind of keep the proverbial screen up for a lot of things. But the more that I roll in the open, it's been very helpful. But in a broader sense, what this really references are two specific instances, and they both happened yesterday. So one, book 2 for campaign 2 of Grey Owls is going to be split into 2 groups. One of those groups is starting next week, and I've had their session 0 already, and we are diving deep into connections. The theme up front in our session 0 was we're going to put a lot of emphasis on the relationships between you and other characters, NPCs, their relationships to the world, to the city that you exist in. And all of the characters have a profession of some type. Maybe that profession is urchin, and they're stealing from everybody, and that's how they survive. Maybe their profession is squire, and they're seeking to become a ring knight, which is essentially like if you've ever seen Alita Battle Angel, it's kind of that kind of feel. You have mechanical suits and you're racing and fighting. But there's a training that goes into that, and there's retirement matches, and this is where the money is. There's also a lot of machinist everything. So everybody has jobs, and you have to defend the border. There are alchemists, there are tailors, everybody's got a job and a skill set. And by doing that, it makes them connected to the world. Now, I put that out there so that the players would start to create connections with each other. If you have a border protector who really likes ring knights, he might try to sneak into one of the games. And if he does that, he might run into the squires. And if one of the players is a squire, they might cross paths. And they can decide narratively, hey, do we cross paths? Yeah, I think we do. I think we're friends. And then we did a session 0.5 where they cross paths. Now, in that, I had presented a little bit of background information. Here's a very brief history of the significant events in Ring Knight history and what your characters would probably be excited about. And they were like, okay, cool. And then I threw them into a narrative set piece. But in that narrative set piece, as I've done in the past, I have put things out there like big terms, like 2 different racers who are old racers that are retiring and are supporting each other are in this fiction block. And I was throwing out other terms that are akin to the world and the setup of a match. And then I presented all that and then went, okay, so what do you do? And one of the players stopped and said, I'm confused. What's this? And what is this? And what does that mean? And what does this mean? And what does that mean? And I went, okay. Sorry, I just derailed the whole thing. No, you didn't. You should know how the world works. And in the past, I think some of my players have just assumed that, oh, okay, I kind of know, I have some idea what that is, or I'll make an inference, and we'll just keep going. And it'll be in the concept of time, we'll just go. But this time, I've been trying to encourage the players, stop and ask questions If you don't understand something, ask. Because especially when it comes to the specific jobs of each of these players, each of these characters, I want them to have a full working knowledge of everything that they would know. So if you're an alchemist, you would know about all the herbs that grow in the city. You would know where to get special ones. You would have a good running list of recipes. You would also have a good running list of recipes that sell well, that your employer wants. And you need to make sure that those are stocked correctly. So you might be sent on missions to go get those. And you should know all that. And you don't have to know it, but you can know it in a document and have a reference doc that's just for you with all that information. Now, in this person asking this question, it also was a wonderful invitation for me to fill in all those gaps. How long does a ring knight actually stay in the ring? And I went, oh yeah, well they need to do at least 5 years, and then they can retire. But if they do that, they're kind of considered weaklings, and they wait till 10. And then sort of thinking about it, like, well, the average time that a wrestler really, like a wrestling career, is 3-ish years, and it can be more, and there are exceptions to that. But this physical taxing thing probably wouldn't be this 20-year affair. It would probably be about 3 years, maybe 5, and then they could retire with an exhibition match and they go do other things, because there are other avenues for the ring knights. Or they stay and they get sponsorships and they become whatever. But that makes the elite more rare, and it makes the other ones who are just like, let's get some quick cash and then retire, more frequent. And it brought up all these cool interpersonal connections that I hadn't fully fleshed out yet. Just because if the players aren't interested in it, I'm not going to put in all that extra work to build out this thing they're not even going to touch. But because they're asking, now I have the opportunity to do that. And it's okay to stop the narrative to make sure we understand. And that's a huge part. How much time does it actually save in the long run if you can clarify, well, this is how this works and this is why it is, and this is your relationship to it. And then you can go much faster after that point. It's okay to stop and check. And there was a fair amount of that. And then that made the situation that the little mini game that we narratively told together through Messenger so much more satisfying and interesting, because we knew what was going on at the onset. And we were encouraged to ask more questions if we're like, wait, how often does this happen? And is this normal? This isn't normal. Oh, so I could react this way instead. And instead of just taking everything at face value, it was a really cool experience that I think set up my experience with playing and running Grey Owl's Legacy, which was run last night with you two and 2 of our friends.
Yeah, before
go
you go too far past this, Adam,
Yeah.
because one of the things this also brings up is the one of my core beliefs about running a game skillfully is you start with a foundation of teaching skills, right? So because as players and as dungeon masters, we are all always teaching, whether we're doing it intentionally or not. So when we make a character choice, we are teaching the table about how we perceive our character and how we are choosing to interact, right? As a dungeon master, whenever you make a ruling, you are teaching your players about what your expectations of the table are, whether those line up with the players' expectations or not. So anytime, this is where, if you think about it as teaching beforehand, there are some very cool ways you can immerse your players and reduce a lot of the common barriers to understanding. So a lot of times, if your world has a lot of terms that mean something to the world, but there's too many terms too fast that are too hard to pronounce, that's a barrier to understanding, because now it's like I've got way too much to memorize, But when you think of it in terms of teaching, and it's like, let's give them 2 or 3 terms to figure out first, and as they get deeper, we'll teach them more at a time, So rather than just dumping 20 terms to memorize, it's like you got 2 or 3, that you bring up in a narrative conversation. And then another NPC brings up a fourth term. And then the dungeon master says, this is what this term means. And then you let them play with that term a little bit in game. Now, as a player, they're accumulating more and more knowledge. And like you also said, having even a personalized reference doc, like almost a glossary of the stuff you know that you could say, so a player can stop and just kind of go over it, that'll reinforce their knowledge. It's almost like doing homework for school, where now you're reinforcing the use of that skill, so that way when you bring it up, the player is going to be confident using it in conversation, rather than, like you said, trying to kind of infer it and feel like they know it, but testing it potentially for the DM to be like, well, that's not how this works in my world. So a lot of times, like if teaching is the foundational skill, now that's going to encourage deeper, more enriching, immersive play.
And I think we had done that. There's a general terminology in a living doc for the whole group. Like, so everyone that's in this city would have a common knowledge of these terms, and we've sort of gone over them. But I think in the first Grey Owls campaign, I had introduced a whole bunch of slang and these little bits of terms, and then I, as the DM, never really reinforced them. And the NPCs didn't really use them much. I used them a little bit in the fiction, but they really weren't brought back. So in play, I had one player that was all set and ready to use all these cool terminology, and no one else bought into that. So they had some of it, but even I kind of forgot about it. Whereas I think having the working knowledge for each person, that they can be a specialist in their field at least, also adds value to their roles at the table and their roles inside the city. So I want them to feel confident in what they know and how to navigate those things. Like, there's gang activity in this city, and those gangs have control over certain prosthetics and certain tattoo levels. And it'd be nice if and there's a player that may have connections with that, and what connections those are, and maybe they're the in that the other players need. But then if they mess with the gangs, then this other character is the specialist. And I'd much rather that character flood me with questions in trying to make sure that they understand, so they can feel empowered and energized by that prospect instead of scared. And it's very cool. And when I talk about pulling back the curtain and having a comfort in that, it also ties into mechanical moments, and when you're not 100% sure about those mechanics. And I think this goes with a good group that you're used to, that you are comfortable with, and who you trust, and they trust you. So there needs to be already that commonality of rapport. But I think this also helps cement trust. So last night we ran our first session of Grey Owl's Legacy, which is taking characters from campaign 1 and continuing onward in a story, a level 20 story. And there were so many little moments of, I won't say like grinding the narrative to a halt, but just pausing and, hey, what's going on with that? And having a nice dialogue about the relationship with the deity, or having a nice dialogue about, so what are short rests in this space? And me being able to say, you know what, I think long rests are going to be 6 hours. I think I'm just going to do that because I don't want to do the full rest thing, and I don't want to introduce that, but I do want things to be a little shorter. Okay, cool. And being able to talk that out with the party, because sometimes on the DM side, we'll make decisions and go, this is probably going to work. And then we see it in play and go, that didn't work. Or even we say it out loud, go, you know, that bothers me. Let's just do it this way. And having that comfort has added a lot more depth to this cooperative storytelling experience. I feel stronger being able to discuss things with you if I'm not sure, or just say them out loud and be able to say, if later this doesn't feel right, I reserve the right to change it, and I'll let you know when it changes. I'll be open and upfront when things change, if they change, and why. And if you disagree, we can have a discussion. There's a lot that's that's very valuable there. And why I preface all of this, why I bring all this up, is there is, and we've talked about it before, there is an insane amount of stress that a DM can sometimes put on themselves to always be 100% sure 100% of the time, even if they're not. That there's this facade that a DM must put on that says, I've got this, I know everything, and it's fine, and I'm good, and of course I planned it that way. And those types of tables are changing, and yet there are still so many tables that are like that. And I wanted to compliment you two and our other players that played last night in being the right group to reinforce a level of comfort in being able to be open in that way, and how wonderful and resounding that experience was, and satisfying that experience was. I could relax and just, here's the story, and here's the next story beat. John cracks a joke, we laugh about it for a little bit, I can laugh at it, here's the next story beat. And even while we're talking about that stuff, I can put the story beat in the chat, and the chat is the running track of the narrative. And if I feel like we missed it, I'll just read it and make sure we got it, and we'll keep on going. And it made it so there's a wonderful give and take that allows for pausing, and it allows for jokes, and it allows for the fun of the table without having to push anything. And being with this group for some time, I was able to plan our 3-act structure based upon what I know all of you are going to explore. And that's from experience.
Yeah, so just because I don't know what people's first episode of this podcast is. So just to kind of reiterate what the play style we've elected for this campaign, and other campaigns I've been a part of. And this isn't every campaign virtually. I know a lot of groups just use a Zoom call, like we're recording this podcast with, and just talk to each other that way. And what we've found works, and I've had a lot of people now say, I thought I would like at the table better, but I end up liking this better, is through Roll20, there's a chat functionality. And basically when you make an in-game decision, or you are like putting it on the record that your character is saying something, you type it into the chat, just what your character says, what they do, what questions you have, like that you can whisper to the DM, the rolls that you make. I use the RNG to the auto roller dice, just so that I'm being very clear that I'm not rolling something and then fudging. There is no question, so that my DM is completely trustworthy on all the calculations I'm making. What that ends up doing is it has a few effects. First, it immediately clarifies what you are saying in character and what you are saying out of character, which is confusion that plagued every other D&D experience I was at, which is I would make a joke and then the DM would start to react, and then it's like, no, I was obviously joking. I was talking about Gundam models. Like that doesn't exist in this world. It wouldn't make sense. And what it does is it allows for a level of seriousness when it's appropriate, but also a level of humor when it's appropriate. And if you want to be humorous in game, at least you're being like, you're making it very clear that you're being humorous in game, which then adds to a greater like character depth. It makes very 3-dimensional characters. One of the other things that the chat does is it allows you to batch process. So one of the things about always having to pay attention to what absolutely everybody else is saying at the table is I want you to imagine it's like a computer with 8 or 9 tabs open, each of those tabs being a facet of the game. One tab for each of the other players, one tab for your notes, one tab for your character sheet. Imagine how slow your browser goes versus just having one tab open that you can type things in, and then letting you relax a little, get up to go to the bathroom, get up to get a glass of water without having to miss anything and come back, because now you have a record of it. And then that record also allows you to go back after the game, so that way if you need a quick refresher, it's not just kind of up to our memory. Now that it's you, either it happened or it didn't happen, and you can see, and then the other thing that it allows you to do is it just reading and listening are just two different parts of your mind that are at work. Like just the way that you interpret it, the way that you process it. Ian can either back me up or disagree on the science of it. But from what I've understand and what I've experienced, being able to read through what someone says just clears up any misunderstanding. It's not like you're going to misinterpret something because of a tonal thing, because it's either written or it's not. And I just find that it's easier to stay engaged with all of the different parts of the game. And like you said, Adam, it allows you to take your time without feeling you're interrupting anything. So a lot of the whisper conversations were like, to me, it's always a more fulfilling experience when the DM can say your character knows this, and then I can deliver that line in character, rather than the DM saying, this is what your character knows, and then me just being like, yeah, what he said, So like if Adam whispers to me, this is how dragons in this world act, and then as a character, I can decide how I want to craft and deliver that information, and then he's there to fill in any gaps if I miss anything important. But really it's a good teamwork kind of exercise of being able to, and that's what makes it immersive. Nobody else saw what Adam said to me, but also they still got the information, and I was able to RP my character more effectively than I think we would be able to if we were trying to have a conversation back and forth. So in my mind, it eliminated a lot of the things where our energy can go unnecessarily by trying to talk to each other, and focus our energy on the stuff that matters, which is the gameplay, the storytelling, and the immersion.
So our mission statement is become your best self through gaming. And this pursuit, especially running the game last night, it is a weird thing for me to also express to my players, hey, I'm a little nervous about this. And normally I wouldn't do that. I would put that energy elsewhere, or try to put that energy elsewhere and fail miserably. And to be able to kind of self-talk through that. And then once we got going, to recognize that in using that process, in making a clear distinction between the gameplay and us playing, like people just enjoying each other's company and cracking jokes and making and having commentary and even asking questions verbally, that's perfectly okay. And then having a whisper, and me being able to manage a whisper while also cracking a joke, or connecting in that way. Those are very different separators. And when DMs get into this, I know I can't be the only person that feels a strange sense of time suck when I'm running a chat. And now, like, I think it cemented last night for me, finally, of like what the function of the chat really works and how it works in my flow. And by doing that, it allowed a point of relaxation where normally I would feel, if I was whispering to someone, that I was somehow neglecting another player. That if I was giving a description of a space, that I was neglecting the whole group because I wasn't speaking to them. Like anything that I was preparing, if I was moving and shuffling a map around while you guys discussed something, that because you were discussing a subject that wasn't the game, I was somehow failing you. That if I didn't have you on point at all times, I was a bad DM. Like that was always that running narrative for me of like, is everyone okay? Are you all right? Is I got to make sure, And
well, yeah, and just to kind of cut in for a second, keeping us on point is exhausting. So it's actually better that there's like almost a mental break that you're shuffling around the maps, because trying to keep us engaged at all times for 6 hours straight just makes me want to throw up a little.
And so that's the final point, is that there are groups that I keep to 3 hours, and we do a 3-hour session with a break after about 90 minutes or so, which is a very good time to have a break. We might, but it'll be like they really are energized by that dynamic improvisational interactions. They want to do the physical interactions and the voices and all that, and that though that is energizing to me as well, it is exhausting. It is a stamina drain. Now, as someone who grew up in the theater and loves that aspect of it, I won't deny them that. And I do enjoy it. But it was so interesting to also enjoy this. It's a different switch for me. And yet I ended energized and it just super happy for the next one with so many ideas of where this could go and where this is all going to go. That's how I want to end sessions. And as I get more comfortable with it, I'm trying to put more and more things into the chat narrative because as expansive as these worlds are, I want to make sure I have a running log of this is what happened. And there's a freedom for a player to say, this is what I say. And as a person, they might be going, I'm not sure what to say about this. You know what? Give me a second. And then they type it out. They can proofread that and then post it. It's great. So I wanted to express that that was a personal growth of becoming more comfortable in that format. And I think it went very well last night.
Absolutely. I think you did a wonderful job last night. It was really nice to be at the table again, virtually, so to speak, just because we've been on break for like a couple of months. So it was really wonderful to come back to these characters and see what kind of story you had planned out for us to experience, to play with, basically. And you said that you've had this like notion in your mind that you have to kind of keep the table in line at all minutes of the session, that like if it's not about the game, then it's not worth talking about, that kind of thing. And I think that speaks to a tradition of perceiving the DM as different from the players, because the DM has more. I mean, there are differences, not to mess anything up here. There are differences. The DM has access to a lot more information. They're the ones who plan the session, yada yada yada. But the DM should also be a type of player at the table. And if you separate yourselves and look at yourselves as more of the shepherd of the table, like that you have to keep all your ducks in a row, then it can be very taxing. But if we also look at it from a different perspective, from like a biological perspective, if we think about child development, constant stimulation is not a good thing for children to experience when they're growing up. There needs to be a break between one stimulus and another so that they can kind of do this, I think it's called synaptic pruning, basically, where they're actually learning the things that they were just experiencing, as opposed to just experiencing it. And I think something similar can be said for DMs and just the table in general. That if all you talk about is the game, if all you talk about is that one story point that you just went through, or everything in the session is revolving around, then it becomes exhausting. Yeah, and there's no route. You have to allow space for things to settle in people's minds, because when that happens, that's when we start coming up with more creative ideas that can revolve around the thing we just experienced. Just like in the movies, if you introduce a character in a movie and you don't give too much information about them, but you give just enough to get people started and speculating, then that becomes a really enjoyable part of the movie. People want to see more because they want to know if they're right or wrong, and they want to see what those people are going to do in various scenarios, which is something that we talked about a couple of episodes ago, where people know your backstory. You just want to see how your character interacts with the world around them based on the path that they've already followed. But yeah, that was something I wanted to mention. John also said something about how the chat creates more immersion in a way that being at the table can't. I think that there's something to be clarified there, because in social media, a lot of people, as we all know, on Facebook and Twitter and stuff, they're all arguing and stuff, and a lot of miscommunication can happen. And somebody who has experienced a lot of that might fear going to Roll20 or going to these other, online D&D media because of the use of this chat and stuff, because there's something that is missing when you're just writing to people, and that's the inflection of your voice. That's how your body language works and stuff. But what's really nice with Roll20, I find, is that you're not just saying what your character's saying. You can also create an image of how they're standing, what their body language is like, what kind of flavor text you want to have to accompany that, to give context to what you're saying. And that allows for a greater sense of not just immersion, but how your characters are feeling. And I think that's really nice because, like I was saying, with all those other social medias and stuff, it's just people talking back and forth to each other, but nobody's like looking at each other. Nobody, like, there's a meme, I think, with Key and Peele, where they text back and forth to each other. And one of them is just like, oh yeah, cool, man. Yeah, like we can meet up at the bar later. And the other one is reading those texts and thinking that that person is really mad at them and shouting at them basically through text. And there's like a huge miscommunication, and they meet up later and one guy is ready to punch the other guy and the other guy's like, oh, hey, you're here. My point is that it's really nice sometimes to have the ability to write out how your character reacts without interrupting other characters' moments or interrupting the narrative flow of the story. Like last night, Adam and I were kind of on point with each other, where we were both typing at the same time. And this was just, there was a little bit of a coincidence, but also it was just really nice to have the chat work it out for us, where Adam would write something in the narrative and then I would write Rowan's reaction. And then immediately after, Adam's next narrative point comes up. And it was just nice when it worked out that way, to have a kind of flow that you don't normally get at the table.
Yeah, well, and I think one other thing here, and the reason I am using the word immersion for it, is a lot of players, the way they immerse themselves in their character is by describing what their character is doing or how they're behaving more than their dialogue. And when you're at the table and everyone's trying to talk, you can't really have more than one conversation going at the same time. And a lot of times it's really interruptive to other players to describe how your character's talking, like you said. So if like a player is like, the reason I'm upset is he killed my and then somebody else is like, I cross my arms and lean against a wall. It's like, that's not really adding to the gameplay element that's happening here. But if we're, say, in a typing scenario where there's a running chat, and, a character's typing out like a dramatic monologue or exposition dump, and another player is like, my character crosses their arms and looks interested. Now, instead of withdrawing from that other player's time, because they get to write in how their character is reacting, it actually adds to the scene. It adds to the description. And there was a lot of times that I got to do a lot of really cool little stuff last night where, one of the things about the character I was playing was that they had dampened emotions and that dampening was taken away from them. So they're experiencing a lot of unfamiliar emotions that they haven't had any practice processing for a good about 30-ish years. So all of a sudden they're feeling fear for the first time, or they're feeling like a different, like a greater sense of humor. Like they're always kind of like dry, but there's something a lot more genuine about what they're expressing, and it always came up in little ways. And what was cool was like, I had spent the entire first Grey Owls campaign building a rapport with another character, Molotov, who we've talked about before. And there were times where like Molotov would check in and we could have a little character back and forth, even if Adam as the DM was focusing on something else, like an environmental description. But we could trust that Adam wasn't missing it, because he could just go back up and read the little side conversation that is really meaningful and really immersive from a character perspective, but doesn't really have an effect on the gameplay, but that is how we're playing, so there's no mechanics that need to happen. And really it's just it's a cool bonding moment that is kind of small, and it means a lot to us, but it's not super meaningful to the overall story from the DM's like architect perspective, where they're trying to set up different relationships and hooks and everything. And I think having a written chat log just gives the space for all of that. And I think that you do lose a lot when you try to just talk everything out. At least, and that's been my experience. And also, I'm fully admitting this is a biased opinion. These are the things I've noticed based on the games I've run and the games I've been a part of that use this kind of format. And I'm also not one that really gets a lot of enjoyment acting out my character. It doesn't mean I don't like it. I just don't. If I could write my character versus act my character, I would much rather write them out. Because to me, now you can express a lot of things that there's not really the room for at the table, because you're sitting at a table. You can't, there's only so much movement you can do and stuff.
This is also an interesting thing where we got to witness a few of our players have expressed that they enjoy using the chat more because it allows them to role play better than if they were put on the spot trying to talk this out. And when you think of things in a written format, I love the idea that you can sort of present trope topics or trope events and kind of push them into play, but don't have to act them out necessarily. So when you say, you could generalize an interaction through the chat and just say, I go and I talk him up. And instead of having to express, okay, what do you say? It's, I'd like to just, I talk to him about his life. What do I find out? And that's all it has to be. And then I can exposit a little bit of information, and cool. If you're not a person that is energized by trying to role play that. And yet I know other people that want to do like the dialogue tree, and this, I say this, and then he says this, and even that we can follow a long track. But I love like presenting common tropes. We play a game of chess, and that's what we go do for a while. And that's fine. You don't have to role play every facet of that. You go play a game of chess. I go make a sandwich. I go hang out in the galley with Iakovos, and we have a sandwich. And if I decide, you know what, this NPC might exposit a little bit, or hey, you notice that Iakovos is really tired, they're really sad, and then that's an invitation for the player to interact. But if I don't feel it's appropriate for that interaction, I'm not going to force an interaction. And that's so cool. We don't have to feel like we have to have certain engagements all the time. And the players, especially if you have a good understanding at the table and a nice, gentle and relaxed rapport at the table, the players will put it out there, the things that they want to interact with and the things that they want to speed ahead, or they want to gloss over. They want to hand wave this, and they want to interact with this. And there was a lot of that last night, and it was a really strong flow. And any points of clarification are just meant to increase that flow later. It wasn't like we had a major misunderstanding and that derailed us for an hour. It was, how does that work? Oh, if that works this way, well, that raises a little more questions. Like, okay, ask those questions. And we had a wonderful discussion, and that provided context moving forward, which increases flow. So I invite DMs who are comfortable at their tables with players that are comfortable to ask those questions without feeling like you have to keep all the secrets. That's the biggest thing of bringing up my particular shower thought to try and bring it to a conclusion, is that the comfort in pulling back the curtain is, it's good if the players know a fair amount of what's going on and they understand the relationships that are connected to them. And if there was something that was wishy-washy in the past, it's really good to clarify and make sure we're 100% clear. This is what we know, and this is what we don't know, and this is what we're not sure about. And that's okay. But clarifying those camps is really helpful, because then you never want to get into a spot where a player goes, wait, did we talk about that? Yes, we definitely talked about that, and you should remember it. That's not okay. We shouldn't be punishing the players for not knowing something if it wasn't clear. And also, how are they going to hold a million different details in their head when it would be so much more effective if we went, remember that deity that you're with is evil and they present as evil. And what could that mean then with their relationship with you? It might be a question there. But you get the sense that they're down to clown, and they'll help you if you ask. But there might be something else going on there. We'll see. And it's okay to sort of plant that seed without having to tell anyone all the lore. It's okay to say, we're not sure about that. And it is also okay to say, you don't know. Maybe there's a question that can come from that too. But it's okay to be clear about what players know and what they don't know and what they kind of know. And, it's okay to just go back and clarify those details. Plus, it allowed me to go, that wasn't clear last time. You know what? We'll say this is what happened. And there are a few moments in that, and that creates a moment for me to say, in the randomness of play, sometimes it doesn't work out the way that might make the most sense. So let's adjust it so that the outcomes are the same, but the way it happened leaves less questions.
So really, one of the things that we're keying in on is what you're secretive about, what you're transparent about, and why one way or another. So, and there are some things that I've gotten into dialogue with DMs, and it's interesting, the line of reasoning. So, for example, like there's a DM I'm playing with, and like he feels bad if we discover a creature's modifier. So, like, if for whatever reason it's like, we know this ogre has a +6 to his attack bonus. It's like, well, as players, you shouldn't really know that. And it's like, first of all, what harm does it do? If we know it's got a +6 attack bonus, there's nothing we can do with that. It's not like we can change that. Now, if, for example, we know that this creature has a +6, but this other creature has a +9, we might prioritize one over the other. But also, ideally, that should be being conveyed by the story already, So there's nothing I find from a gameplay, like, systems perspective that a player could understand informationally that should not also be conveyed in kind of a narrative sense. Your job as a skillful DM, the mechanics and the narrative all fall under the same roof of gameplay. And no matter how a player interprets it, their decisions should still be the same. If they make a different decision based on your narrative description versus if you replay that same thing and you give them a gameplay description and they choose another thing, it means that there's a misalignment between those two things. And ideally, when you're running a game, there should be a harmony between the gameplay mechanics and the narrative. That's why the game is designed like this, And whenever you have that dissonance, now that's something to kind of pay attention to as well. And there was even things like the latest session of Garrus I ran. I started doing something, and I don't know why I wasn't doing this before, but whenever a player dealt one of my creatures damage, I would just type like onto the map, kind of like what you're saying, drawing onto the map, Adam, how much damage that creature had taken. So rather than being like, what does it look like? It was like, that was something where, as a player, theoretically, if a player was keeping absolute track of everything going on, they would know how much damage each creature on the board had taken. So why go through a whole hubbubaloo of being like, well, this guy has 1 bruise and this guy looks more cut up, and or being like, this one has taken 32 damage, and when you can just visually put it on there, using more senses than just focusing on the audible, that all of a sudden created a much more relaxed environment, and the players were able to make clearer, faster decisions, which then sped up the game and made it more fun, because now we weren't wasting energy on unnecessary details.
There's a lot that can be said for presenting information, as long as you know what you're looking at, and how that removes resistance to play in whatever system you're in. When I teach guitar, There is a tool that is utilized. It's often referred to as a chord window, and it is a picture of the guitar fretboard. The line, it's just a set of like lines going down and lines across. But the lines going down are the strings. The lines across are metal separators, and the spaces between those are frets. And then you put little dots on specific strings and specific frets, like a grid of what you press down to perform certain chords. Now, that description and seeing that information, for people that are not learning guitar, that can be a very confusing thing. For everyone who learns guitar, they just boop, that I understand what that looks like, and I understand what the symbols are telling me and what it's supposed to convey. Now I can play this song. It's that chord, then that chord, then that chord, and that chord. And I practice it a few times, I've got it. In a game, Roll20 has a wonderful opportunity to relay bits of information that are not necessary to be conveyed narratively at all times. So if you can remove how many, like, not maybe not how many hit points specifically, but hey, how hurt is this guy? Because I always try to display, if we're fighting something, a little energy bar over them. Not displaying the numbers, but displaying the energy bar, so that they can see knocked down. Oh, he's so close, he's in the red or something, that communicates the gameplay that this thing is hurt. And in so doing that, that also removes my need to describe everything. I might still describe, but we kind of hit it from both ends. And if you miss the description, you can still see the visualization that this thing's hurt. It's a great way to hit folks that learn in all these different ways and have different motes of attention, like different wells of attention for different things. Also, it's a great way to show the game state, the HUD, if you will. And we've said it before that even though you can reveal a game state, it doesn't mean that you can't express yourself in a narrative space either. They're not separate. They're together. They're synergistic. So if you understand all those little things, this thing's AC or my hit points. How well am I doing? Oh boy, my energy's at half. Theirs is at a quarter. Does that then free you up? You don't have to track those things anymore. And that frees you to express yourself in more like social or explorative ways. It frees you up to express yourself in the other pillars of play, now that the other things are sort of automated in a way. I like presenting that information so that it removes resistance for the players.
Yeah, and another thing, because you had mentioned, speaking to or really teaching to, if we were really to boil it back down, multiple intelligences, some people, if you present visual information, are going to pick it up faster than listening to it. Or, as I've found over and over again, you never know when the freaking internet's going to cut out or somebody's going to stutter and you're trying to reconnect and get them to hear. Whereas if it's all typed out, even if they lose their internet connection and have to disconnect and reconnect, they can just go back. It undercuts all of the issues that could come up playing in this kind of environment. Even things like I found music, like more so than even at the table, music accompanied by certain visuals and artwork really help demonstrate a certain kind of world and a certain tone for what you want your gameplay to be like. So I found that, when I was running my latest games, if I've got really soft jazz music, my players react very differently than even if I have music that's just a little bit faster, or there's a different instrument that's playing, So it's really interesting. The decisions they make in combat, depending on what kind of combat music you play. If it's sillier combat music, they tend to make decisions a little bit differently than if the combat music is a little more serious. So I really find that one of the things that this forced us to do was examine how the setup of our games, the tools that we use, can help us quickly get the players into the mindset and the experience that we want them to have. You know, if you don't want your players stressed out and tense, don't have stressful, tense music. You know, if you want them to get into more of an old-timey medieval mood, play a little Skyrim. If you want them to feel a little more modern, play something a little more modern, you know? So a lot of times, like, I find that I am instantly connected to the world just by whatever kind of soundtrack the DM has elected to use in a certain way. And that's also going to affect the tone of how I kind of choose to RP as well.
Yeah, actually, that's kind of interesting because I was speaking with another DM, Joe, on the Darkmoor Podcast Network, and they opt not to use any sort of music during their gameplay sessions when they're recording or anything like that. I mean, they add it in post or something when they're editing, but Joe has had experience where the music takes away from immersion. Like, the DM that they were playing with happened to pick a playlist that was just not going to be conducive to the session that they were at, or they played it too loudly, or they played it too softly, or something like that, or it has words. That's the worst music to use at a D&D session, if you ask me. Right up there with alternative ska or something like that. Like, just like those music that has words. If you play that at a D&D session, it takes away from immersion because the players are on and off listening to what the heck the lyrics are trying to say. Especially if it's a song that everybody loves.
Just did that in my latest 2 sessions, so.
Well, another thing is that, you know, like, if you're gonna use music with words, I would just make it lower, basically, so that it's like a background. The whole point of the music is to create immersion and have a background ambiance, right? But yeah, Joe opts not to use music because they feel that it's going to take away from the session's immersion, probably, in my eyes anyway, based on my discussion with them, because it's a podcast. It's not like a regular, you know, D&D session. It's not scripted by any means, but just like on Critical Role, the way the interactions play out between characters is going to be much different than in like a more free form kind of game or session. So I think it's interesting that sometimes the music might not be appropriate to play, or better yet, you use music and then at the same time, when something happens, or you're implying that something's about to happen with foreshadowing, you cut the music. There's no music. Or I mean, this is what I would do. I would use void sounds. So I don't know what to call it exactly. It's like white noise almost, where it's like a very low.
Atmospheric.
Yeah.
Yeah, or ambient noise.
Yeah, where it's like you're not hearing any music anymore. You just hear the sounds of the cave you're in. Or you hear, like in Undertale, they have a amazing soundtrack, by the way. They have a moment where all the music cuts and it's just this low vibrating sound like that. And that it's jarring. So by creating contrast, just like when creating a good horror, you need to have contrast in your musical track for good immersion at your session.
So one other thing that Adam used in this last session, and I had used because a player had suggested it to me, and actually it worked really well, was actually using a timer to set for 90 minutes for a break. And what that spoke to was more tracking and accountability. Because a lot of times what can happen is we know that players need a break, right? They need a little bit of a recharge. And 90 minutes for our table seemed to be the time that it was an optimal amount of gameplay, break, kind of thing. And also helped keep you on track of where you were in the act structure of your session, you know? So are you still in Act 1 at your first break, or did you zoom by Act 1 by your first break, or how closely did it kind of line up? But I know, at least for me, one of the things that used to happen was it'd be like, all right, let's take a break in 90 minutes. And then the 90 minutes would come up And it's like, all right, well, let's resolve this thing. And then that starts another thing. Let's resolve this thing. And then by the time, another hour's gone by without a break. And, whereas if you've got a timer, now it's like, all right, you get one more thing you get to say. We can even continue this when we come back. But we are going to take a break now, whether you like it or not. And again, what it did is it kept everybody in a good groove. And it kept me a lot more energized throughout the session, because now, kind of like what Ian said about not having constant stimuli, in addition to being free to step away from the computer and stretch, walk around, go to the bathroom, whatever I needed to do, beyond that, it gave everybody the time to follow up with each other, check in with each other, see what was going well, clear up anything that might have been confusing. And it just led to a stronger chapter overall, like a chapter within the chapter, And I know that there's been a lot of research into education about things like chunking and the ability to kind of close off a pocket of information that can then be referenced later. And it's just the going along with the science of what we understand of how our brain works definitely contributed to the enjoyment of the session overall, which, isn't that really the point of all of this?
And I think the timing of this, I used to put in breaks every 2 hours, and actually that was taxing. So there's something about the 90-minute mark that provides a lot of opportunities. And it's strange because it's there, but it isn't hard and fast, because it'll, like last night, the first one went off and we were at a really good spot that we could just pause right there. And the second one went off and I silenced it. I think Ian asked, "What was that song?" And it's like, that was my alarm. Here we go. And we're just going to finish this thought, and then we're going to take our break. And that's all that has to happen. Also, if you're in the middle of someone's turn and it's this intense combat, finish that person's turn. And I think there might be a different sort of intensity with combat. Also, though, I've been running pretty efficient combats. Combat doesn't take an extended amount of time at the moment. And if it does, then I finish a round or two and then I take the break. So that there's like a point. And also, in a lot of ways, it's like I'm almost training the players and I'm training myself to have things in smaller chunks. And that's a good thing. It ends up being more energizing. And then I have players that are going to make more intelligent decisions in the combats because they're not exhausted. And I do know, again, a facet of the old guard of going, we marathon for 8 hours straight without stopping. And man, I was so messed up by the end. Like it's a badge of honor. When wouldn't you want to just end on a high note and be able to feel energized? And if you're at someone's house, be able to, drive home without falling asleep at the wheel, maybe that's a good thing, and it's a lot of changing that paradigm for some people that I gotta just dig in hard and get stamina through it and just muscle through it. And it's like, but why? When if we just take a break, then everyone will be fresher and it'll be a more enjoyable gaming experience.
Yeah, and also rather than setting it up as kind of an either or, like challenging their current paradigm, like setting it up as a what becomes possible question. So like, all right, well, it's kind of like how we used to do 24 hours of karate, where we try to stay up all 24 hours and then be zombies the next day. And that was an experience, right? I had a lot of fun doing it. That doesn't mean I still want to do it. But the idea being like, all right, you've done that. I'm glad you really had fun. What becomes possible when? And now they get to elect into it. So rather than telling them their way is wrong and our way is right, it's more like, try it out, like totally understand if you're skeptical. Like I can already hear people criticizing this method of gameplay, of being like, well, that's not true D&D, or it doesn't feel authentic. And it's like, valid. Your authentic is whatever you feel it is. and what becomes possible when you give it a try. You know, ultimately that's part of being your best self, or delving deeper into the way you've done it, is that there's change and growth, you know? So if you've always done it the way you've always done it, you can never have more fun with it because you're doing it the way you've always done it. And in fact, sometimes you can burn out and you can have less fun doing it the way you've always done it. So if anything, this might be a good way to change it up. And the worst thing that's going to happen is you're not going to have fun with it, and you're going to validate the feeling you had to begin with. So wouldn't that be a good thing, right? To know that you were onto something all along. But we've just found with this kind of gameplay, this kind of back and forth, using this structure and this setup, personally, I have found the most enjoyment in the sessions I've been a part of, kind of running things this way. And ultimately, it did begin with the possibility question: what becomes possible if it doesn't matter what everyone's internet speed is? You know, if somebody doesn't have access to a mic, if somebody doesn't have access to a webcam, what is a way we can structure the interaction of the game so that the internet connection isn't even a factor, right? It just so happened to have all of these other benefits attached to it. And the only time where I've found I haven't really had fun with it is when other people have not really given an honest attempt at trying to understand how it works, and they try to default to what they've always known, you know, and it creates like a conflict of some people are speaking out loud, some people are typing things, some people are typing and then speaking, some people are speaking and then typing, rather than just agreeing ahead of time of what is going to work out best given the technology we have and given the comfort level of what we all have.
That's pretty interesting because it speaks to this idea of a stagnant state, basically, of D&D and how people play it. Like, you know, if you go back to first edition and stuff, it was still, D&D was still kind of in its infancy. The DM was making a lot of rolls for the players when the players would, you know, decide to make actions and stuff. And slowly moved away from that, where each player has their own dice now, and they get to make their own skill checks and stuff, and the DM tells them how it turns out from there. I think the people who criticize this kind of change in how we're playing the game are the same people who are just like afraid that it's not going to work for them, and also people who are scared to change something because they fear that they can't go back. Like you're saying, like the worst thing that can happen is that you're validating the feeling you had in the first place. If we treat D&D like it's a, you know, crystalline form that is immutable, basically, you know, if we give it the immutable feature, like in Monster Stat Block, where you can't change it at all, then you're never going to learn what might be a more fun way to play it. And this is something that really speaks to that idea of how to become your best self through gaming, because when you change the way when you change the game, when you change the way you're playing it, the way you set it up, that's giving you more experiences to rely on for future endeavors. So just because it doesn't work out this time doesn't mean you didn't learn anything or that it wasn't a waste of time. Or maybe it did work out really well, and now you can use that in the future. Use even not even just the exact way you ran the game that one time, but choosing elements that you felt really spoke to you and your table. That's how you can keep improving upon this game. Like 5th edition isn't the end of the D&D, you know, franchise where they're creating, you know, new settings and new rule books and stuff like that. It's not the end. I mean, just like look at Tasha's, right? And people are anticipating 6th edition. Well, maybe that's how you can kind of look at your own gameplay as a DM. You know, looking to level up, basically, to find that next edition of your gameplay that makes it more, you know, that makes it smoother, makes it more immersive, and just makes it more fun overall. And I think that's something that we all need to keep in mind, that you don't have to be stuck in one way of playing this game. Just like how other people have seen what this game has done and taken away and added their own parts to it to create their own settings that are not to do not that don't have anything to do with Faerun or the Forgotten Realms at all. They even creating their own games. Like if you see on the Darkmoor Podcast Network, Playing Out of Character isn't playing 5th edition. They're playing a different setting, a different game altogether that is based on D6s and has mixed successes for DCs as opposed to just a hard pass-fail. And I think that's really amazing. So, you know, let's take that innovation that we're seeing in other games, that we're seeing at other tables, and apply it to our own lives.
Yeah, and really, it's funny too, because sometimes we'll talk about the old guard. I'm going to refer to them as the most passionate community members, because they are passionate. The most passionate D&D players are also the ones that are always discussing homebrew and custom rulings and custom systems that you can implement in your game. Really, how is this so much different than homebrew? You know, all we're doing is changing the primary mode of communication of the game. We're basically homebrewing the game structure. And really, it's to create a specific experience that's going to engage players in a specific way, right? So just like having a custom rest system is going to engage how a player approaches an encounter or a series of encounters. You know, if I'm playing a character and I know my short rest is an hour, I'm going to approach an encounter differently than if a short rest is 4 hours, you know, or if a short rest is 10 minutes, you know. Your abilities are going to be able to recharge at different rates. It's going to change your willingness to use certain features or not. And really, as what we can do is we can, as the DMs, we're fine-tuning the feeling that a player has when it comes to their willingness to use certain features of their character. You know, for me, having played this game for 4 going on 5 years now this year, I find that I want my players to use more of their features more often. Not necessarily the more powerful features, but just more features. I want my warlocks to use more spells, right? So why would I have a system that's going to discourage them from doing that, you know? So, and that's where I think the first thing is understanding the feeling you want your players to have and the things that, seeing the kinds of decisions you want your players to make, and then making a structural call, like a rules call, to make that match up. You know, one of the things I wanted my players to not feel like is that I'm playing favorites, right? So that's why I stopped using inspiration, because a lot of times DMs, one of the feelings is that, you know, well, this player is that DM's favorite. That's why they keep getting inspiration. And I feel like my role playing is always overlooked because we're not jiving together. So how do you take that out of the equation? Everyone starts with an inspiration at the end of every, what I call a full rest. And that's using a homebrew by Dungeon Coach, who's on YouTube. You can go check out all his stuff. But the idea with that is the way I've structured the quest design of my games is that at the end of every session, it is guaranteed your characters will get a full rest. They get absolutely everything back, and they get a point of inspiration to start fresh for our next session, you know? And that way, players feel like they have an inspiration to burn, but they never feel like I'm playing a favorite, because they're all getting an absolute equal chance at building their character, building their equipment, building their spell gens. All of that was transparent systems, so that, again, it's like, I'm not going to give Ian a better weapon than I give Adam, or I don't give everyone one thing, but obviously, like, this character can make more use of it than that character. So really, even though I gave it to the party, I was giving it to this character. It's like, the reason I designed that weapon upgrade system is so that every player has an equal chance to be just as powerful as any other character, so that everyone starts with equal footing, you know? And sometimes you're looking at it from a dynamics perspective, like, how do I want the players at the table to get along? Sometimes you're looking at it from a systems perspective. Do I think that rogue is too powerful and these other classes aren't as powerful, you know? So that's where the short rest system came from. Fighters and warlocks aren't using their features as much, how do I get them to use their features more, you know? So when you're making a lot of these considerations, these are all knobs and levers for you to turn more drastically or more subtly, depending on what you want. But like you said, Adam, this all comes back to pulling away the curtain, you know? So now that you're transparent and you're willing to admit this is something we're going to work on together, you're relinquishing control so that you can invest yourself in greater enjoyment out of the game as a whole.
And isn't that just the goal? Just to get a little more enjoyment out of the game as a whole at every table that we're at. I mean, my goodness. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to today's episode of the DM Shower Thoughts. This podcast uploads on iTunes and Spotify every Friday at noon, and you should go check out that and subscribe. I believe that you can actually download them through those venues. If you want to help support the show and gain access to exclusive content, as well as watching the recording process of this show, you should consider becoming a patron of the show over at patreon.com/DM Shower Thoughts. And for news and announcements on our blogs, YouTube channel, and all the other facets of cool things that we do on Twitch, Twitter, and whatnot, you should go find our Facebook group. You can find it if you search DM Shower Thoughts, but it is Dungeons & Dragons DM Shower Thoughts, because Facebook's silly. Have a wonderful day, everybody, and please, game responsibly. Bye-bye now.
I think the core of Dungeons & Dragons is puzzle and encounter design. I'll draw from favorite movies, video games, books, anything to create a one-of-a-kind play experience. When you start with a solid framework, all you need is to grab your best friends and hilarity ensues naturally. I'm Sully, Dungeon Master and host of the podcast How Friends Roll, a 5th edition actual play podcast of micro-campaigns featuring a rotating cast of characters. Come join our table. How Friends Roll is available wherever you get your podcasts.